On a warm autumn afternoon, Jasmine Carter drove through the quiet suburban streets of Silverwood. She was focused on the road ahead, her mind occupied with thoughts of an upcoming case at the law firm she worked for. She had been making a name for herself in the legal world, rising quickly as a sharp and dedicated lawyer who knew her stuff. But in this moment, the noise of the world faded to the hum of her car's engine and the rhythmic beat of the tires on the road. Without warning, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flash of red and blue lights. In her rearview mirror, she sighed and pulled over to the side of the road, not surprised, but still a little annoyed. It had been a long week, and she didn't need any more interruptions. But she knew how it went. Staying calm was the key, so she switched off the engine, put the car in park, and rolled down her window. Officer Tom Green approached her vehicle with a purposeful stride, his uniform crisply ironed and his expression unreadable. As he stopped in front of her car, his gaze lingered for a moment on her face before moving to her car's license plate, and then back to her. Jasmine could feel his eyes on her, though she kept her own gaze steady, looking straight ahead and maintaining her composure. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. Jasmine paused for a brief second before responding. "I believe I may have missed a stop sign," she said with a calm voice that didn't waver, though her heart had started to beat a little faster. She had been distracted by an urgent call from work and hadn't noticed the sign. She knew she couldn't avoid the fine, but she hoped he would understand. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around her car, inspecting the rearview mirror and the side of the vehicle as though searching for something wrong beyond the infraction. She had admitted to Jasmine's patience was wearing thin, but she said nothing. She didn't want to escalate the situation. She simply waited in silence, trying to steady her nerves while keeping her face neutral. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Green finally turned to her. "Once more, I'm issuing you a citation for failure to stop at the stop sign," he said, his tone flat. No negotiation, no empathy. Jasmine nodded. She knew it was coming, but there was something about his demeanor that rubbed her the wrong way. His eyes seemed to study her as though she were someone to be judged, rather than simply a person caught in a minor mistake. Something about his attitude felt off, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you, officer," she said, though it felt more like a formality than anything genuine. As he handed her the ticket, Jasmine noticed a slight tension in the air between them, the kind that she had experienced far too often in her life, a quiet discomfort that seemed to bubble up whenever she was in the presence of authority figures who looked at her and saw only what they expected to see, not who she truly was. Not the accomplished professional or the dedicated lawyer, just another black woman on the road. She took the ticket without a word, holding it for a moment as if weighing her next step before she finally folded it and placed it in the glove compartment with a quiet exhale. Officer Green turned to walk back to his patrol car, and Jasmine watched him disappear in the rearview mirror before starting her car and slowly pulling back onto the road. As she drove away, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the encounter settle in her chest. It wasn't the fine that bothered her. It was the feeling of being reduced to something less than human, something she fought against every day in her career. But here in this moment, it was impossible to ignore. Weeks later, Jasmine arrived at the courthouse early on the morning of her hearing. The building loomed ahead with its tall columns and polished granite steps, reflecting the early morning sun. She stepped out of her car with a quiet confidence, her black heels clicking against the pavement. As she approached the entrance, she adjusted the sleeve of her tailored blazer and straightened her posture before entering the building. The air inside the courthouse was cool and smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors. It was a familiar setting for her, though today it felt different. This time, she wasn't there as a lawyer. She was the one in the defendant's seat. She walked through the hallway toward courtroom 7A, where her case was scheduled to be heard. Her mind was clear, her thoughts focused. She had been through much more complex cases than this, but as she neared the door, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her stomach. She pushed the feeling aside and entered the courtroom, taking a seat at the defendant's table. As she glanced around the room, she noticed the usual mix of spectators, reporters, and lawyers scattered about. There was an unfamiliar tension in the air, though no one could place it. Judge William Hargrove was already seated at the bench, his gavel resting in front of him, a stern expression on his face, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him. He was an older man well into his 60s, known for his sharp tongue and his tendency to make quick judgments. He had a reputation for being tough and unyielding, and Jasmine had heard stories about him from colleagues over the years. Some said he was fair, others said he was a relic of a past time who never adjusted to the changing tides of the legal system. Either way, Jasmine knew this wasn't going to be an easy day. The clerk called her name, and she stood up straight, adjusting her glasses. As she walked toward the front of the courtroom, her heels clicking with each step, she felt every set of eyes on her, and she didn't like it, but she pushed the discomfort aside. She couldn't afford to show weakness today. She was here to fight the fine she had been given, and she was going to make her case. Judge Hargrove looked down at her with an almost dismissive glance. His eyes flicked over her attire and then lingered for a moment on her face before he cleared his throat. "Well, Miss Carter, it seems you've decided to contest this fine," he said, his voice gravelly and sharp. Jasmine nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe there were extenuating circumstances surrounding the incident, and I'd like the opportunity to explain them," she replied, her voice calm and controlled, but with a firmness that came from years of experience in the courtroom. Hargrove raised an eyebrow and set down his papers before addressing her with a skeptical tone. "I'm sure you've got a good reason, Miss Carter, but let's not waste time here," he said, a slight edge to his voice, as if she were just another defendant trying to talk their way out of a mistake. Jasmine felt the sting of his words, but didn't let it show. She was used to this kind of treatment, especially from authority figures who assumed she didn't belong, but she was determined to prove them wrong today. She was a lawyer, just like the rest of them, and her case was valid. She took a deep breath before beginning to explain the situation: the emergency call from her office, the momentary distraction that led her to miss the stop sign. She laid out the facts clearly and concisely with no embellishment, but Judge Hargrove didn't seem interested. He cut her off halfway through the explanation and glanced at the clock as if he had better things to do. "Your story sounds plausible, Miss Carter, but that doesn't change the fact that the law is the law," he said, his voice colder now. Jasmine bit her lip, but held her ground. She wouldn't let him dismiss her so easily. As the courtroom fell into a brief silence, the weight of Judge Hargrove's words hung in the air. Jasmine stood before him, her face calm, but her mind racing. She had expected resistance, but the dismissiveness stung more than she anticipated. She knew the law inside and out, but here she was standing in front of a judge who seemed more concerned with getting through the day than ensuring justice was served. She wasn't just fighting a ticket. She was fighting a system that too often overlooked her achievements, and her worth. Judge Hargrove picked up a few papers from the desk, his eyes scanning them as though he were already moving on to the next case. He looked at Jasmine again, clearly uninterested in hearing more from her. But before he could proceed, the courtroom clerk, a young woman named Sarah, quietly approached the bench and whispered something in the judge's ear. Judge Hargrove's brow furrowed slightly, and he looked at Sarah with a mix of curiosity and concern. Jasmine's mind raced. What could they be talking about? Had something happened? She didn't know if it was the heat in the room or the tension in the air, but she felt an odd, uncomfortable sensation deep in her gut. Was it possible that someone had checked her background? No, that would be too much of a coincidence. The judge looked back at Jasmine, his expression now one of faint surprise. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the desk lightly as he spoke. "Miss Carter, it appears there's been some misunderstanding," he said, his tone softer now, almost tentative. "I've just been informed that you're not just a regular lawyer, are you?" Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she had a sinking feeling she knew what was coming. Her reputation, her career, everything she had worked for might be coming to light. She chose not to answer immediately, instead offering a polite but steady gaze at the judge. Let him figure it out for himself, she thought. Let him come to terms with the truth. Judge Hargrove, who had initially dismissed her case with condescension, now seemed to be re-evaluating everything. He set the papers down and glanced at his phone, scrolling through something briefly. "It says here, you're actually a federal appeals judge," he murmured, as if the information was both surprising and bewildering to him. "The youngest in the country, if I'm reading this correctly." He looked up at her, his expression now one of genuine shock. "Is this true?" Jasmine met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. It is true," she replied, her voice steady and controlled, though there was an undeniable flicker of something behind her eyes. She could feel the shift in the room, the sudden awareness that had spread through the courtroom like wildfire. She was no longer just a woman standing before a judge in a traffic case. She was someone who commanded authority, someone with power and influence in the very system that Judge Hargrove presided over. For a moment, the judge simply stared at her, as if trying to process the full weight of the revelation. His gaze flicked back down to his papers, then back to her, his face pale with realization. He had been quick to assume that Jasmine was just another defendant, someone without influence or stature. But now, with this new knowledge, the dynamics had shifted entirely. Jasmine wasn't a typical traffic offender. She was a legal prodigy, a force to be reckoned with. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the audience shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the magnitude of the situation set in. The clerk had turned her head to the side, now looking at the judge with a mix of confusion and awe. Jasmine, however, remained perfectly still, her posture straight and her eyes calm. She had been underestimated countless times before, but today, in this very moment, her quiet power was undeniable. The judge's earlier harshness had already begun to fade, replaced by an almost reluctant respect. "Miss Carter," Judge Hargrove finally said, his voice considerably softer now. He paused, searching for the right words. "I apologize for not recognizing who you are." His words were awkward, almost apologetic, but Jasmine could sense the struggle within him. The tension in the room had shifted from one of conflict to one of realization. "I see now that I've misjudged you." Jasmine nodded slightly, not offering the apology he had expected, but giving him a quiet acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred. It wasn't her place to make him feel better about his mistake. He needed to learn from it, just as the entire system did. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice even and deliberate. As Judge Hargrove fumbled with his papers, his demeanor noticeably changed. The forceful, authoritative air that had filled the room earlier had dissipated, replaced by a cautious humility. Jasmine stood there, her posture still perfect, as though she had expected nothing less. But inside, her thoughts were a whirlwind. This moment, the sudden shift in power, was both satisfying and troubling. She wasn't just a young lawyer fighting a ticket anymore. She was now part of something bigger, something that carried implications far beyond this courtroom. The room, which had been tense and almost suffocating just moments before, felt lighter now. The audience, who had been silently observing the scene, seemed to breathe easier, the whispered conversations becoming louder as the news of her identity spread. She could sense the weight of the room's newfound curiosity, the unspoken questions that lingered in the air. How did this young woman become the youngest federal appeals judge in history? What did it mean for the system when someone like her was present in a space like this? The questions buzzed around her, but Jasmine didn't allow herself to be distracted. Her goal was the same as it had always been, to fight for fairness, to challenge the assumptions that had been placed upon her. Judge Hargrove cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable with the realization of his misstep. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice soft but steady now, "I have to admit I underestimated you. It's not every day that someone in your position finds themselves in front of a judge like me over a traffic violation." His eyes flicked to the ticket on the desk, and his expression seemed to soften further. "I have been informed of your work, your contributions to the legal field. I regret that I didn't recognize who you were sooner." Jasmine remained silent, letting his words hang in the air. She wasn't interested in his apology. She had heard many apologies throughout her career, especially when people realized they had made assumptions about her based on the color of her skin or her age. But it was never about the apology. It was about change, about breaking down the walls that caused those assumptions to begin with. She wasn't here for validation or to prove herself. She was here to ensure that people like her, people who were often overlooked and underestimated, wouldn't have to fight so hard to be seen. Judge Hargrove looked back at her, this time with a more measured expression. "I should have known better," he continued, his voice quiet, almost regretful. I've spent so much of my career in this chair, but I've never taken the time to question the biases I carry with me. I've never thought about how my assumptions might cloud my judgment, especially when it comes to people like you. Jasmine could feel the sincerity in his words, but she knew that this moment couldn't just be about him. It couldn't be about him being a judge who had realized he was wrong. It had to be about something bigger. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I appreciate your acknowledgement, but this isn't just about you or me. This is about a system that consistently overlooks people like me. The biases you mention are embedded in everything we do, from the courtroom to the boardroom, from the street to the highest offices in the land. It's time we start confronting them." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no defensiveness in his gaze, no urge to justify his past actions. He was listening, truly listening, in a way Jasmine hadn't expected. In that moment, she knew that whatever came of this case, it had already made a difference. The room was silent as the judge stood up, signaling that the time had come for a decision. He paused for a long moment, then finally spoke, his voice now more measured and respectful than before. "Miss Carter," he said, "I hereby dismiss the fine. Your case is more than just a traffic violation. It's a reminder that we all need to do better, that we must constantly reevaluate the assumptions we make and how those assumptions shape our judgments." He turned his gaze toward the courtroom at large, his voice gaining strength. "Let this be a lesson to us all." Jasmine felt a small but profound sense of relief wash over her. The fine was gone, but more importantly, the seeds of change had been planted. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she knew that this was just one small victory in the larger fight for justice and equality. But it was a victory nonetheless, and for today, that was enough. As Jasmine stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of the decision slowly began to settle in. The momentary victory was bittersweet. It wasn't just about the fine or the ticket, it was about the message she had sent. The biases that clouded judgment in spaces like the courtroom couldn't be ignored anymore. She had been dismissed once, but in the end, her identity as a legal force had shone through. Her victory today was not just for herself, but for anyone who had been underestimated, sidelined, or ignored. It was a small but meaningful crack in a larger system, and for that, Jasmine felt both proud and humbled. As she made her way through the courthouse hallways, the whispers she had overheard earlier had turned into open conversations. People glanced at her as she passed, some with curiosity, others with quiet admiration. She didn't let it distract her. She didn't need their approval. She was used to the scrutiny. The constant gaze of people who expected her to be one thing, and then discovering she was something entirely different. But today, there was no hiding from the reality she had just exposed. At the courthouse exit, a reporter caught sight of her. He stepped forward, his camera dangling at his side, eager for a soundbite. "Miss Carter," he called out, his voice cutting through the air. "Would you mind answering a few questions about the case? People are already buzzing about your appearance in court today." Jasmine hesitated for a moment, then turned toward him. She knew how the media worked. They would twist her words, frame her as some kind of symbol, but that didn't matter. What mattered was getting her message out in the right way. She'd been quiet for long enough. It was time for others to hear her truth. "Of course," she replied calmly, offering the reporter a soft but genuine smile. The reporter raised his microphone and the camera started rolling. "What made you decide to contest the fine?" he asked, his tone professional yet probing. Jasmine took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. It wasn't just about the fine, she began. It was about what the fine represented. It was about the assumption that because of who I am, because of my appearance or my background, I should be treated differently. I've worked in this system for years, and I've seen firsthand how people can be dismissed based on those assumptions. Today wasn't just about one ticket. It was about confronting those biases head-on. The reporter nodded, seeming to digest her words as his camera continued to capture the exchange. "So you're saying this was a moment of racial bias?" he pressed, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Jasmine's gaze never wavered. "It's not about pointing fingers," she replied. It's about recognizing patterns. These things are deeply ingrained and they affect all of us, whether we realize it or not. Those biases influence how we make decisions every day. I'm in a position where I can call attention to it. I can speak up, but it's not just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been overlooked because of their race, their gender, or their age. It's time we start having these conversations openly. The reporter seemed taken aback, perhaps not expecting such a direct response. He nodded slowly, as if processing the weight of her words. Before he could ask another question, Jasmine turned to leave. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm and final. As she walked out of the courthouse and into the bright light of the afternoon, Jasmine felt a sense of clarity she hadn't expected. The weight of her position had always been there, but now it felt more purposeful than ever. Today, she had stood up not just for herself, but for those who couldn't, those who didn't have the platform or the privilege to challenge the assumptions of the world around them. This was just the beginning. She had made her stand, but there was still so much to be done. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her colleague at the firm, Eric. Asterisk, you did it. I saw the footage. That was incredible. Asterisk. Jasmine smiled as she typed a quick reply. Asterisk, thanks, Eric, but this is just the start. We have a long way to go. Asterisk. As she slid her phone back into her bag, Jasmine looked up at the sky, taking in a deep breath. The fight was far from over, but she felt more ready than ever to continue it. For herself, for her community, and for everyone who had been dismissed, forgotten, or silenced. The battle for equality and justice was ongoing, but today she had made a difference, and that in itself was a victory. The following days were a whirlwind for Jasmine. News outlets picked up the story of her courtroom encounter, and soon her name was everywhere. Headlines celebrated her as the youngest federal appeals judge to challenge the very system she helped uphold. The spotlight, however, was a double-edged sword. She was now in the public eye for reasons far beyond her legal expertise, and while part of her relished the opportunity to amplify her message, the attention also brought its own set of challenges. At work, her colleagues congratulated her on the bold move she had made. Eric, her close friend and fellow lawyer, couldn't stop texting her with words of encouragement. "You were brilliant in that interview," he had said. "This is going to change everything." Jasmine appreciated the support, but she knew the road ahead wouldn't be so simple. People didn't always like being confronted with their biases, especially when those biases were exposed on a public stage. She could already sense the ripple effect in the legal world, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and discomfort. People who had once dismissed her as just another young lawyer were now reconsidering their previous assumptions. But would this newfound recognition translate into meaningful change, or would it simply be another fleeting moment of progress? In the days that followed, she was invited to speak at various events, from legal panels to community outreach programs, about her experience. Each opportunity gave her a platform to challenge the status quo, but it also placed more pressure on her shoulders. Jasmine wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was now a symbol, whether she liked it or not, of the change that needed to happen in the legal system. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but Jasmine had always known that true progress required action, and she was determined to lead that charge. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of interviews, Jasmine found herself sitting alone in her apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city below, but today, even the view seemed distant. Her mind was restless, her thoughts a constant swirl of doubt and determination. She had always been driven by her desire to make a difference, to break down the barriers that stood in her way. But now that she had the chance to do so, the enormity of the task felt overwhelming. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her mentor, Judge Carter, a respected figure in the legal community who had been one of the first to recognize her potential. He saw your interview, the message began. You did well, but remember, this fight is bigger than just one case or one headline. Don't let them turn you into a symbol. Keep your focus on the real work that needs to be done. Jasmine stared at the screen, reading the words over and over. Asterisk, this fight is bigger than just one case or one headline. Asterisk. She knew Judge Carter was right. The case she had won in the courthouse wasn't the end. It was just one chapter in a much larger battle for equality and justice. The biases that plagued the system weren't going to disappear after a single courtroom victory, and the work she needed to do wouldn't be easy. Jasmine's thoughts turned back to her own journey, the years of hard work, the late nights studying law, the sacrifices she had made to get to this point. It had all been worth it, but it was only a small part of the change that still needed to happen. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine put down her phone and stood up from the couch. She walked over to the window, looking out at the city, now bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. The weight of the world felt less heavy now. The realization that the fight would be long, difficult, and complex didn't scare her. It fueled her. She wasn't just going to be a symbol. She was going to be a force. And no matter how daunting the challenge, Jasmine Carter would keep fighting. Not just for herself, but for the countless people who had never had a voice, for those who had been silenced by the very system meant to protect them. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. Weeks turned into months, and Jasmine found herself fully immersed in her new role, not just as a judge, but as an outspoken advocate for systemic change. Her visibility continued to grow, and while it was exhausting, it was also invigorating. Every new interview, every panel she spoke on, felt like an opportunity to push the conversation forward. Yet the weight of her new responsibilities began to settle in, and Jasmine was careful not to let the media frenzy distract her from the deeper, more challenging work ahead. She spent her days back in the courtroom, presiding over cases with the same level of precision and integrity she had always upheld. But her passion for the law was now intertwined with a deeper desire to reshape it, to confront the biases that had long been woven into its fabric. Her rulings had become more deliberate, thoughtful. She wasn't just deciding cases based on precedent and the law. She was also considering the larger implications of each decision, the impact it would have on the communities that had so often been overlooked or mistreated by the system. It wasn't long before Jasmine started receiving invitations to join task forces aimed at reforming the legal system, particularly in regard to racial bias and representation in the judiciary. She was asked to participate in conversations with lawmakers, activists, and legal experts who were pushing for change at the legislative level. Though the work was demanding, Jasmine didn't hesitate. She knew the stakes were high, and it wasn't enough to change minds within the confines of a courtroom. The change she sought had to be systemic, and that meant engaging with those who held the power to shape the laws of the land. Still, her journey wasn't without its challenges. As her influence grew, so did the pushback. Not everyone in the legal community was thrilled with Jasmine's rise. Some dismissed her as a political figure, a symbol rather than a judge. Others were openly critical, accusing her of pushing an agenda or allowing her personal beliefs to cloud her judgments. But Jasmine had been prepared for this. She had spent her entire career proving that she belonged, that her success wasn't the result of favoritism or luck, but of hard work and dedication. She had fought for every opportunity, every promotion, every case she had won, and she wasn't about to let anyone discredit her now. One afternoon, as Jasmine reviewed a complex case involving civil rights violations, she received a call from her former law professor, Professor Harper. "Jasmine," he said, his voice laced with concern, "I've been hearing some troubling things about how your career is being perceived. People are questioning your objectivity. They're saying you're too focused on race and politics to make impartial decisions." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to process the words. She had expected this, but hearing it from someone she respected, someone who had helped shape her legal career, made it sting a little more. "I've always been clear about where I stand, Professor," she said, her voice firm. "The law is supposed to be impartial, but the system isn't. The law may be blind, but the people who interpret it are not. And if we don't confront that, we're doing a disservice to everyone." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Professor Harper spoke again, his tone was softer. "I know you're doing what you believe is right. I just don't want to see you lose sight of the balance between reform and the law. You have to be careful. The pressure will only increase, and people will try to test you. I've been tested my whole life, Jasmine replied, her words quiet but resolute. I know what's at stake, but if I don't speak up, who will? The conversation ended with a promise to continue the dialogue, but Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would only get more difficult. She had already sacrificed so much to get to where she was, and now she was facing the hard truth. Her fight for justice would not be easy, and not everyone would stand behind her. Some would always question her motives, dismiss her efforts, and label her as radical, but Jasmine wasn't afraid of that. As she hung up the phone, she thought back to her earliest days in law school, when she had first realized that justice wasn't a given. It was something that had to be fought for. She had chosen this path because she believed in its potential for fairness, but now she saw how far it had to go. The system was deeply flawed, and it would take more than one person to fix it. But Jasmine had always known she couldn't walk away from a fight that mattered. She wasn't in this for recognition. She wasn't in it for the applause. She was in it for change. And no matter how many obstacles or critics stood in her way, Jasmine was ready to keep fighting. She knew that real progress didn't happen overnight. But every case, every conversation, every challenge was another step forward. And she was determined to keep moving, no matter what months passed, and Jasmine's impact began to ripple through the legal community in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her work on task forces, her public statements, and her thoughtful rulings were starting to shape conversations about justice and reform across the nation. Slowly but surely, she was becoming a symbol of the change that so many had longed for. But the deeper Jasmine dove into the fight for systemic reform, the more she realized that while change was possible, it was not without its costs. The pushback she had initially encountered grew more intense. Her critics, emboldened by her increasing visibility, found new ways to attack her credibility. They questioned her qualifications, her impartiality, and even her loyalty to the law. Some suggested she was too radical, too eager to break the system, while others dismissed her as an opportunist. The noise was loud, and though Jasmine had learned to tune out the distractions, the pressure started to weigh heavily on her. She knew she couldn't stop. She knew she couldn't back down. But there were moments when she wondered if the fight would ever be enough. One night, after a particularly challenging day of hearings and media inquiries, Jasmine sat alone in her office, the city skyline illuminated outside her window. She had just finished reviewing a case involving a controversial police shooting. It was the kind of case that made headlines and sparked debate. Her judgment on this matter could shape public perception of her, and she was acutely aware of the responsibility on her shoulders. But as she stared at the legal brief in front of her, she realized she wasn't thinking about her reputation. She wasn't concerned with what the media or her critics would say. What mattered was the truth of the case. What mattered was the people who had been harmed, the lives that had been lost, and the broken systems that needed to be fixed. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from her colleague, Judge Anderson. Asterisk. Just wanted to remind you that you're not alone in this fight. You got a team of us who have your back. Keep going. Asterisk. The simple words gave her the encouragement she needed. Jasmine had always known the fight would be lonely at times, but messages like this reminded her that change was a collective effort. She wasn't in it alone, even when the weight of the world felt like it was on her shoulders. There were others, judges, lawyers, activists, who shared her vision, who believed that the law could be a force for good, even when the road ahead seemed long and treacherous. The next day, as she walked into the courthouse, a feeling of clarity washed over her. She wasn't just fighting for reform, she was fighting for a legacy. The system that had shaped her career was broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. It would take time, persistence, and collaboration, but Jasmine knew that real change would come. It had to. In court that morning, Jasmine delivered a ruling that would become one of the most significant of her career. It was a landmark decision involving racial profiling and police misconduct, one that would set a new precedent for accountability. The case wasn't easy, but Jasmine didn't hesitate. She knew what was right, and she was prepared to stand firm in her belief. When the decision was handed down, the courtroom fell silent, a moment of recognition not just for her ruling, but for the courage it took to make it. As the days passed, the media buzzed about the ruling. Critics called it controversial, while supporters hailed it as a victory for justice. Jasmine knew it would take time for the legal community to absorb the implications of her decision, but she also knew that it was a step in the right direction. The phone calls and messages came flooding in. The support from her peers, especially those who had once been skeptical of her, was overwhelming. She had proven herself not just as a judge, but as a voice for the voiceless, a champion of fairness in a world that too often overlooked the most vulnerable. Jasmine had earned the respect of those who mattered most, those who saw her for the work she was doing, not the labels others tried to place on her. Sitting in her office that evening, Jasmine allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had faced countless obstacles, endured personal attacks, and overcome systemic barriers that had been in place for generations. But she had made it through, not by giving in to the pressure, but by staying true to her principles. Jasmine knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but as she looked at the world she was helping to shape, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The fight for justice wasn't over, but Jasmine Carter was no longer just a young judge with a dream. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the world was finally beginning to see it. The change was happening, and Jasmine was leading the way.